The former British ambassador to Russia said Saturday that the high-stakes meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin was a diplomatic victory for Russia. The summit in Alaska produced nothing for Mr. Trump and gave Mr. Putin most of what he was looking for, said Laurie Bristow, British ambassador to Russia from 2016 to 2020. In an interview with the Associated Press, Bristow said Putin has broken out of international isolation, appeared on the world stage as one of two global leaders and wasn't in the least challenged by Trump, who also ignored an arrest warrant issued for Putin by the International Criminal Court. Bristow added that Trump seemed to think of Putin as someone with whom he can do a business deal, but that is a fundamental error. Putin is a KGB operative and he is not looking for a deal, he's looking to win, he said. Although Putin flattered Trump absolutely shamelessly during their joint press statements, there did appear to be some trolling, he said. That included Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov appearing to wear a sweater with USSR emblazoned on it in Russian and Putin being greeted with a flypast of B-2 bombers, most recently used in strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. That could be read as a mark of respect, Bristow said, but it could also be a pointed message to Putin reminding him of who is the more powerful partner here, as Russia does not have similar capabilities. The meeting followed a week of intense European diplomacy in which leaders tried to convince Trump not to sell out Ukraine. That likely worked, Bristow said, adding that the outcome of the meeting could have been a lot worse. The question now, he said, is how to achieve a ceasefire in Ukraine when Putin doesn't want one. Trump has repeatedly threatened Moscow with more economic pressure but has largely refrained from taking additional sanctions steps. Trump needs to turn on the tap to Ukraine with military support and then double down on Moscow with economic pressure, Bristow said. Unless Mr. Putin is absolutely convinced that he cannot win militarily, the fighting is not going to stop. That's the big takeaway from the Anchorage summit, Bristow told AP.
It produced nothing for Mr. Trump and actually gave Mr. Putin most of what he was looking for. So in terms of what Mr. Putin went into the meeting looking for, he's broken out of international isolation. He's appeared on the world stage, as one of two global leaders, basically deciding the fate of the world and of lesser countries over their heads if necessary. He wasn't in the least challenged on what he describes as the underlying causes of the war. Quite the contrary. While this summit was taking place, his forces were bombing Ukrainian civilians. There's no accountability for any of that. He's an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court. That had no effect whatsoever on the summit. He drew Mr. Trump into a discussion about the bilateral US-Russia relationship, putting to one side the fact that a very large part of the problem here is what Mr. Putin, what his forces are doing in Ukraine, in the middle of Europe right now. So altogether, a pretty good day for Mr. Putin, I would say. My sense is that Mr. Trump would like to do a deal with Mr. Putin. I mean, he seems to think of Mr. Putin, as essentially someone with whom he can do a business deal, so one businessman to another. I think that's the fundamental error. Mr. Putin is a KGB operative. He's not looking for the kind of deal that Mr. Trump is looking for here. What he's looking for, and this came out very clearly in the press conference, he's looking to win. His objectives in Ukraine haven't changed in the slightest, as far as we can tell, and I don't think they will. So I think the point about the diplomacy of the last week is a very important one. My sense is that the very intense diplomacy going on between the UK, the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the Trump administration probably did contribute to us not having the kind of outcome this morning where we'd all be looking at this thinking, what on earth just happened here? So essentially an outcome that sells the Ukrainians down the river. I strongly suspect actually that the European and UK diplomacy did get Mr. Trump into a rather better place on that. I mean, it could have been a lot worse. We could have been this morning looking at the kind of ceasefire arrangement that I think was being touted around in recent weeks, which is essentially, it's a very, very compromising set of arrangements for Ukraine that would have fundamentally made it much harder for them to conduct any kind of defense against continued Russian aggression, would have caused serious domestic political difficulties for Ukrainians themselves, would have had Mr. Putin sort of, dancing in the streets, frankly. We're not there, and it's a great, very good thing we're not there. The really big question for me this morning is where do we go next? How do you enable Ukraine to defend itself against continued Russian aggression for as long as Mr. Putin is in the Kremlin? That's the real question here. Now, you can do that in a number of ways. I think doing it through trying to bring Ukraine into NATO is almost certainly unachievable, given the circumstances we all know about. But I don't think it's actually necessarily the only answer to the question. The answer to the question, I think, comes down to two things. One is providing the Ukrainians with the equipment, the resources, the money, the political support, the targeting data, and all the rest of it that enables them, to defend themselves against continued Russian aggression. And the other is Mr. Putin believing it. This is really the heart of any deterrence arrangement, that your adversary needs to believe that you mean it and you will keep it up. So if I were advising Mr. Trump this morning, my advice would be, in a nutshell, this is the point at which you go for maximum pressure on Russia. And you do that on two fronts. One is that you really turn on the tap to the Ukrainians in terms of military support, not because we want, the war to continue, but precisely the opposite. We want the fighting to stop. But unless Mr. Putin is absolutely convinced that he cannot win militarily, the fighting is not going to stop. That's the big takeaway from the Anchorage summit. The other is that you really double down on economic pressure. So, Mr. Putin's economy, the Russian economy, is in quite serious trouble now. That won't kick in fast enough or deeply enough for Mr. Putin to be forced to cease and desist in Ukraine in the coming months. But it certainly narrows his options over time, and it increases the pressure on the Russian system. It's just worth pointing out a couple of bits of what I think were trolling going on. So Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister, turning up with an USSR T-shirt. How does that work? There was something really quite, I think, nicely done about the planes flying over when Putin was on the red carpet. So you can read it two ways. You can read it as a mark of respect to a visiting statesman, not something I would have done in the circumstances, but there you are. The other way you can read this is, we've got B2s. You've got nothing like this, and you never will have. So let's just remember, who is the more powerful partner here. I think if we compare where we are in August with where we were in February, we're in a much, much better place, all of us, I would say, including the United States, actually. So keeping the discussion about how do we get to that ceasefire that we all want and need, except for Mr. Putin. And it's Mr. Putin's decision to launch the war, and it will be his decision to go for a ceasefire if he does. How do we get Mr. Putin there?